Alright, what's going on everyone? In this video we're going to be building out this modern form from scratch with HTML and CSS. It will teach you about core HTML and CSS principles such as responsiveness, as a form will be responsive, flexbox for the layout, a great trick for positioning elements absolute, and also creating this floating label when focusing into the inputs. As with all tutorials, I definitely recommend you coding along with me, or if you want to challenge yourself, attempt to recreate the form and then come back and watch my solution. No matter which direction you choose, you can find the starting files along with the completed form over on GitHub. Now before we get started, if you do enjoy the video and you want to see more projects like this from scratch, be sure to leave a like on this down below. Also, if you're not subscribed, be sure to do that for more content like this. Alright, let's get started. Okay, within VS Code to get started, I just have a folder called Assets which contains 3 images we're going to be using for the form, and you can find these on the GitHub repository. Now what we want to do is create a few files. We want to create an index.html file, and we also want to create a style.css file. And inside of the index.html file, we want to start off by creating a new boilerplate using Emmet, and then we want to give it a title here, which we'll call Elegant Form with HTML and CSS. And then what we also want to do is link up our style sheet here inside of the head tag, and then we'll point this to our style sheet. Okay, now that we have that set up, let's begin to work on the markup for the form. Now, to view the changes as you make them inside of this HTML file and also our style sheet later on, we're going to be using an extension called Live Server, which is available within VS Code. So if you come over to the Extensions tab here and type in Live Server, you'll be able to see that you want to install this one right here. Alright, now once you have that installed, you can right-hand click on your HTML file and click Open with Live Server, and this is going to open up the actual HTML file inside of your browser, and each time that we make a change now within our HTML file or our style sheet, it'll be reflected here in real time. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to put our browser side by side within VS Code here, so that way as we're making changes within our HTML file and CSS file, we can see them happening here on the same screen to make it a little bit easier to see what's going on. And also to save some space, I'll just collapse the side panel here. Alright, let's get started with the markup. Inside of the body tag, we're going to create a div with a class of container. And then inside of here, we're going to create a div with a class of sign up form. And let's spell that right. So this div is going to be for the entire form here. And let's actually make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. So this div is going to be for the entire form itself. Now inside of this div, we want to have a div for the form image and then a div for the form content. So create a div and we'll call this form image, and then we'll copy this down and we'll say form content like this. All right. Now inside of the form image div, and let's go back to our actual browser preview here, we just want to create an image here, or an image tag, and we want to direct the source to our assets folder, and we want to use the form-bg photo. Okay, and that's all we need to do for the form image. Now inside of the form content here, we want to create a div for the form heading. So we'll create a div and give it a class of form heading like this. And then inside of here, we're going to have an image, and we want to direct this to our assets folder, and we're going to use the logo.png. And then beneath this, we're going to have an h1, and the text is going to say create account. And then we'll have a paragraph tag underneath here, and to save some time, I don't want to type all this out. This is going to say, please fill out all the required fields to create your account. And if we save that and we scroll down, you can see that's all going to be right here. Now beneath the form heading, we want to create the markup or structure for the form inputs. So we'll create a new div, and we're going to give this a class of input wrap. And inside of here, we want to create a div with a class of input for each input that we're going to have. So inside of this div, we'll create our input field, and it's going to have a type of text for the first one, and we'll give it an ID of user name. Okay. And then beneath our input, we'll create a div, and we're going to give it the class of label. And inside of here, we want to create a label tag, and we're going to say, or we're going to give it a for attribute that is going to match the ID that we pass it here. So we'll say username. All right. And for the value inside of this label, we just want to say username like this. Okay, so that is going to be the structure that we need for the remainder of our 3 inputs. So what we can do is just copy this down 3 more times. And then the next field that we want is going to be for the email. So we'll change the type here to email, and then we'll change the ID, the for attribute, and also the actual value of the label to email here. And then we'll say email. Next, we want to create one for the password. So this is going to have a type of password, and then we'll change the ID and also the for here to password, and then we'll give it a value or a label value of password. And then the last one is going to be for the confirm password. So again, we want to give it a type of password, and then we'll give it an ID and for of confirm password, and then a value here of confirm password. Okay, and that is going to be all of the inputs. Now the last element that we need to create is going to be our button, and that's going to go inside of the div with the class of input wrap just below our last input here. Now on the button we want to give it a type attribute, and we're going to set this to the value of submit. And then for the value of the button we're going to say create account here. Okay, now one mistake that I did make is on the div with the class of form content, this should actually be a form element, not a div. All right, and that should do it for the HTML, and inside of the browser we should have something that looks like this. Okay, let's begin to work on the style of our form here. So first off, what we're going to do is we're going to be using a font from Google called Poppin. So we want to select this one here, and if we scroll down we can select all the font weights that we want. So we're going to select the light font weight, the medium font weight, and also the semi-bold here. And then on the top right hand corner we can view the selected font families, and we have 2 different ways we can add these to our project, either through the link tag or we can use the import directive, and we're going to opt to use the import directive. So we want to copy this snippet here, or this import directive, and we want to paste it into our style sheet here. Okay, and then what we want to do is we're going to do a reset here on our entire project. So a reset is when you set the margin to 0, the padding to 0, and then you set a property called box sizing to border box. And on here we're going to set the font family, and what we want to do is, you can see here, we'll just actually copy this whole font family property and we'll paste it in here. And now inside of our project you can see that all the font is now going to be Poppins. Now before we continue to style up the form, one change that I want to make within our markup is we actually don't have a need for this div with the class of container that is wrapping our sign of form, so we can actually remove this. Alright, it's just an extra div that I realized we didn't need. So we'll save that, and then back inside of our style sheet, what we want to do next is target our body, and we're going to pass this a few properties. So first we'll add a height property, and we'll set this to be 100 view H, which stands for the entire viewport here. Next, we'll pass it a display property and set the value to grid, and then we'll add a property called place items, which is going to push everything to the center, which right now it's not going to work because everything still has not been styled, so it's still going to look a little weird. But once we start targeting the image and the form content, things will start to go into place, and I'll kind of take this off to show you what that's going to look like without it. Then we'll set a background color on here to a value of F1, 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 which is like a white smoke, I like to call it. And we'll set the font weight of everything to 300, and then we'll add some padding on the left and right hand side. So we'll say 0 for the top and bottom, and then 24 pixels to target the left and right hand side of our body here. Okay. Next, we're going to target the sign up form itself. So we'll say sign up form. And in here, we're going to set the display to flex, and we're going to be doing what is called a mobile first approach. So by default, we want the flex direction here to be a column, which is currently what it's at. So we're not going to see really anything change. Next, we're going to set a max width of 900 pixels, and then we'll set a width property to be 100%. So what this pretty much means is we want this div of signup form to get no larger than 900 pixels, but if it's actually not 900 pixels, like the screen size, for example, is maybe 850 pixels, we still want it to take up the full space available, which is why we have this property of width and we set it to 100%. So hopefully that makes sense. Then we'll add a box shadow here, which to save some time, I'll just copy and paste this in from the finished signup form, which you can find on the GitHub repository. And then we'll add a border radius of 12 pixels around all sides, and then a background color of white here. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be doing what is called a mobile first approach. So beneath our signup form here, we'll create what is called a media query, and we want to pass it a min width value. So we want to say at a minimum width of 900 pixels, apply all the styles that are inside of this media query. So we'll target the signup form, and then we're going to set the flex direction to a row. Okay, so since the current viewport is at 900 pixels and above, this is going to be applied, which is why now you are seeing the layout of our signup form is now in a row. So if we scroll over, you can see we have the form content over here. Next, let's work on this form image, because currently, as you can see, it is overflowing and making things not look so great. So beneath our signup form div here, let's target the form image div we have. And we're doing a mobile first approach like I mentioned. So on mobile, we actually don't want to show this form image at all. So we're going to give it a property of display and set the value to none. All right, and that's all we need to add here initially. But once we get to a minimum width of 900 pixels, we want to actually add a few properties to this div. So we'll target the form image here, and we're going to give it first off, we want to set this display to be block once it gets to 900 pixels. We're going to add a property called flex basis, and we're going to set this to 45%. Now, a simple explanation, if you're unfamiliar with what this does, is the signup form here can be considered as 100% from left to right. So what we want to have the image do is take up 45% of this actual space here, and then the form content will take up the remaining space. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Then we'll add a background image property here, and we're going to have this really cool effect using one of the assets that I have provided, which you can find again on the GitHub repository. So we'll pass a URL here, and then we want to navigate to the assets. Let's see here, background image URL, and we'll do our assets, and then we want to grab this image here called BG black square. And then finally, we'll pass a border radius property to 12 pixels on the top left, 0 on the top right, 0 on the bottom right, and then 12 pixels on the bottom left. Okay, so if we save that, you can see we now have this really cool background effect with our actual form image here. All right, and then what we also want to do is we can target inside of here the form image div and then the image itself. So we'll say form image and then our image here, and we want to set a width to be 100%. We're going to set a height to be 100%, and if we save this, as you can see, it's going to actually come in to take up that 45% of the actual form here. But as you can see, the image is being constricted. So one property we can add here is called object fit, and we have a few values we can add for this property, but one that works really well is what is called cover. And if we do that, it's going to pretty much just cover the actual space available with that image. Okay, so I think that looks really good. And then lastly here, we're just going to add a border radius again of this 12 pixels on the top left, 0 on the top right, 0 on the bottom right, and then 12 on the bottom left, because as you can see here, it's kind of overflowing. So to fix that, we can just add a border radius to the image itself. Now that we have the form image styled, let's begin to work on the form content. So outside of our media query and just below the form image, let's target the div that we have called form content. And we want to set the display on this div to be flex. We'll set the flex direction to column. We're going to align all the items to the center and then add some padding around all sides with 32 pixels. Okay. Then inside of the form content, we have the form heading. And let's spell that right. And what we want to do inside of this is we just want to align all the text to the center with the text align property. And then we want to add a margin on the bottom and set that to 32 pixels. Okay. Now inside of the form heading div, we have this image, we have our H1, and we have this paragraph tag. So currently the image is way too large, so let's fix that. So what we're going to do is we'll target the form heading and then the image inside of there, and we'll set the width to be 50 pixels, and then we'll set a height to auto, and that looks much better. Okay. So next we have the H1 inside of the form heading div, and what we're going to do here is we'll set the font size, and this will be 24 pixels, and then the font weight will be 500. Now once we get to a larger screen with our media query here, we want to increase this font size for the H1. So beneath our form image, we'll copy this in, we'll remove the font weight, and the font size we want to add is going to be 32 pixels. Okay. Then beneath this, we're going to target the form heading once more, and then we have our paragraph tag, and we want to set the font size initially to 14 pixels. And then once we get to our media query of 900 pixels, we'll target this again, and then we'll set this to be 16 pixels like that. Okay, let's begin to work on styling these inputs. So just outside of our media query below our form heading paragraph selector, let's target the div with a class of input wrap. And we want to set the display to flex. We're going to set the flex direction to be column, and we want to set the width to be 100%. Now we want to add some space between each one of these children inside of this div here. And to do that very easily using flexbox, we can actually use a property called gap, and we can set the amount of pixels or whatever kind of units you want to use here to add space between each one of these children inside of this div here. Okay. Now, if you're unfamiliar with gap, gap is actually a shorthand for the properties of row gap and also column gap. And if you wanted to pass both the row and column gap, if we actually hover over this, you can see the syntax is row gap and then column gap. So right now we're setting it for both row and column, but if you wanted to do 48 pixels for the row and then maybe something like 20 pixels for the column, it would look something like this, which is kind of similar to what you see when you do padding. Okay, so we'll just keep it as gap, and then we'll set the value here to 48 pixels. Then after our input wrap selector, let's target the div that has a class of input, which is wrapping our input and our label here. So we want to set a display property on here, and we'll set this to flex. We want to set a flex direction, which we'll set to column, and we also want to set a position, and we'll set this to relative, and we'll see why this is important in a little bit. But once we set that, as you can see, the inputs now take up the full space available. All right. Now inside of this input, we have our actual input itself. So we'll target the input div, and then we have our input element. So we want to set a width here to be 100%. We're going to do some padding on the top and bottom of 8 pixels, 0 on the left and right. And we want to get rid of this initial border here. So we're going to set border to none. And then we want to just add a border on the bottom. So we'll say border bottom, 1 pixel. This will be solid. And then we want to use the color of 1A1. 824, which is like a dark purple, okay, which is kind of hard to see, but it is this color right here. Then we want to set a font size to 14 pixels, a font weight to 300, and then we're also going to add a transition here of 300 milliseconds because we're going to be adding a focus effect to the input itself, and we want to transition that by 300 milliseconds. All right, so currently this is what we have when we click into the input. So right now when we click in and focus into the input, we just have this default outline here, which doesn't look so good, but the reason why we want it is for accessibility purposes. So let's just make this a little bit better. So what we can do is target the input div again, the input, and then target it inside of a focus state, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to take away that outline, we'll set that to none, and then we're going to set a box shadow on here, which I'm going to copy and paste in with 1 pixel here, and then a color of 6236FF, which is a purple, and then we want to change our border color to the same thing. Okay, so it'll be 6236FF. Okay. So now when we hover in here, you can see we're going to have this really cool focus effect that we can actually see on the finished version here. All right, so it looks much better than the default outline. So the next thing that we need to do is position these labels directly inside of the input themselves. Now to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to target the div with a class of label. And we're first going to set the position to absolute. And that's going to set this label div now absolute to our input div here, okay? Because we've set that to be relative right here. Now what we want to do is we want to give this a height of 100%. And what this is going to do is make this label div now take up 100% of the height available inside of our input. Now to center our label inside of the center of the input, what we can do is actually use flexbox. Now in other methods of aligning this to the center, you may use a top or a bottom property and set it to something like 5 pixels and try to align it in the center like that. But that can be very tedious, and if the font size of the label changes, then you have to tinker with this value here. Now one cool trick that I like to do is we can set the display to be flex, and then we can set the align items property to center here to get that perfectly center inside of our input. And this is a cool little trick that I use whenever I need to position a certain element in the center of, like a search bar, or in our case here, our input. So then we're also going to set the transition property here to 300 milliseconds ease. And then I also realized we didn't set ease here on this transition as well. So let's set that. And for the label itself, we want to target the label div and then our label, and we'll set the display to block. We'll set the font size to 14 pixels, and then we'll set it to a color here, which is going to be B0, 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 which is like a nice gray color. And if we save that, we now have something that looks like this. Now currently, if we focus into the input and we type in the input, as you can see, the placeholder or label is still there. So when we focus into the input, we want to have the label actually transition to be above the input. So to do this, what we want to do is you want to target the input and then the input in a focus state here. And then we want to target the label itself. So we can do that by saying plus and then getting the label here. So that's going to target the next actual sibling after the input itself. So hopefully that makes sense. So when this input is in a focus state, we want to target the label div here. And all we want to do is you want to give it a transform property, and then we want to translate this on the y-axis, and we'll say minus 27 pixels here. So now when we actually focus into the input here, as you can see, the label is going to transition above it, allowing for the user to type in the actual input itself. And we're also going to add some additional styling to the label itself when it's in this focus state. So what we can do is just copy the selector here, and then we'll paste it, and then we'll target the actual label, and we'll set the font weight to be 500, and we'll also set the color back to initial. All right, so now when we focus into here, you can see it's going to become a little bit bolder and also go back to the default color. So one current problem that we have with our inputs is if we type in a value into the input and we focus out of it, the label comes back and covers the value that we typed in. Now we have a few different ways that we can fix this using only CSS, but we could also use something like JavaScript as well, but we won't be getting into that here within this video. So I'll show you a few solutions that we can use to fix this. So the first one here is not my favorite, but it does work. But we can target the div with a class of input, pretty much just the same thing here. So let's just copy this. And what we can do is instead of saying is the input in a focus state, we can say is it valid. Now what we want to also do is this is going to say it's valid by default. For each of these inputs here, we would have to add a required attribute. Okay, so for example, we have one on the username field here. So if we say username, this is a valid field, so now it's going to stay in its position because we are targeting the input in a valid state and then the label again. Okay, now the one drawback to this is, for example, if we go to our email here and we say required, And now, for example, if we just, let's save this here and it'll refresh. So now if we type in an email here, say we just type in John, but that is not a valid email, so it's going to still come down. So I don't necessarily like this way. Another way that I like a lot better is actually using the not selector and looking for a placeholder. So what we can do is, instead of saying input valid, we can use the not selector here. And then we can say colon placeholder shown. And then what we want to do here is, on the input itself, we have to add a placeholder, and we have to make sure it's actually empty. We can't actually just have it be like this. We have to put a space in there. Okay, so now regardless if the actual input is valid, you could, validate it with JavaScript. If the actual input has value, then it'll stay in its position here as you're seeing. So if we type in username here, that will stay in its position. And for example, if we add a placeholder here for the email with a space, and then we type in the email here, just John, it's still going to stay in that position. So we're going to be using the placeholder method here for our form. And we'll also want to copy this selector here and add it to the style of our label as well. Now the last element that we need to style is going to be this button. So let's target our button here, and then let's scroll down to get this into a better view. And we want to add some padding to this, so we'll say 12 pixels on the top and bottom, 18 pixels on the left and right. We're going to get rid of the border here, so we'll say border none. We're going to align this button to the start, so we'll say align self and pass it a value of flex start. Then we'll give it a background color here of the purple we used of 6236FF. We'll give it a text color of white, and then we'll add a border radius of 12 pixels, and then a transition here of 300 milliseconds ease like this. Okay, so now we should have our button. So we'll also be adding a hover effect here, so we want to target the button, and then we'll say in a hover state. And then here we're going to say a cursor, a pointer. We'll set the background color to the white smoke, which is the F1 value. And then we'll set the text color to the purple that we've been using of 6236FF. And then lastly, we'll add a box shadow here. All right, and that should be our button. So if we hover over it, we should have this nice hover effect here. And that's going to do it for our modern form build here. Now, just to check out the responsiveness, if we inspect this, and as you can see, currently we're at 903. As soon as we get below 900, you can see that the image is going to disappear and the form is going to be fully responsive no matter what screen size you are on. All right, and as soon as we get above 900, the image will reappear. So hopefully you guys did enjoy this. If you guys did and you want to see more videos like this from scratch, be sure to drop a like on it and subscribe if you're new, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.